Hi. That's really interesting. I mean, I was in the department when we started to think about learning game work, and I was always really suspicious of it. Now I obviously look back and think I should have been less suspicious about that and more read about the conception of TEF coming along,
Yeah.
which was well after my time. But it just seems obviously it's a much richer source. As you said, I do have an affection for the NSS and student satisfaction data, but you are right that actually using that to have an informed discussion of students, and as you said, having a kind of proper adult conversation is a good thing. I suppose it might be difficult for you to say what next with Learning Gain, because at the moment the department is in a very specific place. This is a much bigger endeavour, but it's the better endeavour. But it's hard, I suppose. I don't know if you're able to say anything about, any views you've had from the OFS or the department about what next on Learning Gain.
Well, I think the one thing is quite a lot of people thought we might just get a silver bullet metric, like Sam finished university and he got 7 qubits of knowledge, and I finished university and I had 5. And you just add all those up, and, King's gets, whatever, and Sheffield gets whatever. And we've sort of said, yeah, that's not an option. So there's not going to be like a metric that goes in the TEF, but there's a huge range of ways Learning Gain data could be used either in the TEF or a lot of the other regulatory instruments that are being developed right now. In terms of what I like to call the kind of creative writing exercise of the qualitative submission, certainly could be more evidence-based. There's discussions about setting up sort of a resource of methodological approaches that institutions could sort of use to self-assess and then report back on. There's models of this on the voluntary system of accountability in the US, which can feed into a lot of student decision-making, for example. There's also a lot of ways that this data fits into the objectives of the OFS in terms of advice for students, prospective students, social mobility and attainment gaps. So how do we start to look at attainment gaps using Learning Gain data as we go along? And regulatory measures like the access agreements that are going to start to get a lot more attention and put a lot more teeth on it, as well as roles with the QAA. So how does this fit into the kind of quality regime? Because of course that's kind of being looked at in new ways as well. And they're very much in favor of bringing more metrics into a lot of those discussions rather than just the processes. So I think there's a whole range of ways in sort of a national framework. I think what I argue for is if we solely leave this to academics, say, hey, this is kind of good, I'll maybe do a bit of this on the side, it's not going to get prioritized when you have high stakes metrics on things like graduate salaries, graduate job destinations, student satisfaction that you have to chase to keep your job in a lot of institutions. And then say, oh, well, there's this nice stuff about learning over here, but are you actually ever going to get around to it? So you need to find a way to kind of feed it into that accountability structure more broadly within and beyond institutions for it to kind of have that teeth to it, which I think is important, because if you're not being held accountable to learn, if you don't want to be held accountable to learning, then what do you think a university, should be about? I'm not saying it's easy, and there's a lot of ways you can get it wrong, but I don't think you want to say, oh no, we just don't want to think about that. And I think right now that's a policy question that people are starting to realize they do need to answer.
Any other questions?
Thanks for that. It was a really great, also sort of super fast run through. On the satisfaction versus engagement, I think that's a really interesting discussion, and I've been having as well. Like, why are we measuring satisfaction when it doesn't tell us anything about engagement, really? We ask students if they're happy. Of course, they're going to be happy if they get easier grades and don't have to show up to get them. Whereas and it's not perfect, but the NESI in the States asks questions about how many hours did you study outside of class? Are you able to connect the ideas you learned in these 2 classes or whatever together? So really trying to measure whether it's perfect or not, critical thinking, and what they're really gaining from the knowledge they're learning in multiple classes. So what are your thoughts on how we move away from satisfaction as the measure people are confusing with engagement? Because even students are like, I want to be satisfied. And who doesn't want to be happy? But are you learning, or are you just happy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a place for this, the NSS, and it's done actually a lot more than anything else to raise institutional attention on the student experience and on teaching. Yes, students deserve to have a coherent timetable, and yes, that helps support their learning. So I think although the kind of general push towards satisfaction is not ideal and it's not great, one of the reasons that NSS has had such currency is we haven't been giving many alternatives to it. I think the NESI data you talk about in the US or the UCAS that's now being run by Advance HE, the metrics aren't as clear. And people are kind of actually not wanting to engage very deeply with some of the metrics. They want it to kind of say more is better. Whereas with some of the engagement data, you go, well, it's not that you have to ask a question in every class. You know, so it's kind of like, it's not just simple data that you can kind of rank the way you can with the NSS. Even if it's not necessarily methodologically sound, it gives the impression that you can do that. So I think some of it's about putting different metrics into the system and getting people to start to think about it. And a lot of people say, oh no, but it's the rankings that drive this. But actually, the rankings are just like vampires. I mean, they're not discriminate. They just use whatever data is available. If you give them data on learning gain, they'll start chucking that into their models and metrics, you know, to sell newspapers and magazines. They're not driving a lot of, I mean, they're just using what's there. So the NSS is there, so they use that. If the sector got together and put lots of data about learning in the mix, then that would start to get attention in a way. So I think some of it's about researchers pushing this agenda to how do we get some more of this data put out there, and how do we not be so precious about, oh, but we don't want it to be used for any accountability purposes. I mean, so I think the NSS has its place, but I think it does need to be balanced and kind of say, well, that's important for some aspects of the student experience, but that's actually not very good at capturing student learning and putting some more actually meat on the bones of what we mean about that.